What happens when a black woman is fired for being not a good fit, despite being the best on the team? What if her silence wasn't weakness but strategy? And what if the man who fired her had no idea who she was really connected to? This story starts with quiet cruelty and ends with a storm he never saw coming. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The meeting room smelled like lemon polish and artificial calm. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears, heavy and deliberate. Danielle Brooks sat perfectly upright in the leather chair, her palms resting flat on her thighs, her breath steady despite the way her stomach had curled into a tight, coiled knot. Across from her, Charles Whitmore leaned back in his chair like a man settling in for a glass of wine. His smile wasn't warm. It was smug, practiced, and hollow. The kind of expression corporate men wore when they were about to call something a strategic decision. "Danielle," he began, voice smooth like syrup laced with poison, "you're not a good fit here anymore." No preamble, no performance review, no real reason. She blinked once. "I beg your pardon." The HR rep, a woman Danielle had only spoken to twice, sat stiffly near the window, pretending to scan a notepad but never writing a word. She didn't meet Danielle's eyes, didn't even shift in her seat, just sat there like a plant someone forgot to water. Charles sighed like he was the one being inconvenienced. "It's not about your work, it's just the culture. We're pivoting. We need people who align better with where we're going." Danielle didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction. "I've been here for 4 years. 3.5, he corrected, almost cheerfully. "My team just broke a quarterly record," she said quietly. "You used my strategy deck at last month's summit. Your exact words were game-changing." His shrug was effortless. That was then. The silence between them thickened. Danielle could feel the injustice sitting on her chest like weight, but she stood, smoothing the front of her charcoal blazer with care. Her voice never wavered. "I'll have my things cleared by the end of the hour." Charles smiled. That same goddamn smile. No need to rush. She turned and walked out, not fast, not slow, just steady. Her heels clicked against the tile like punctuation marks. The office was quiet as she passed. Faces turned just slightly. Not one voice spoke. Not one friend stood. The weight of complicity hung in the air like fog. She packed her things in silence. A framed photo of her and her sister. A plant that always leaned toward the window. Files she once color-coded, believing that order meant something here. It didn't. When the elevator doors closed behind her, Danielle didn't cry, but she'd never forget that silence. Danielle stood at her desk, her gray blazer crisp against the early afternoon light. Every movement was precise, folding her scarf, unplugging her charger, tucking her mug into the corner of a cardboard box she didn't plan to fill. To anyone watching, she looked composed, professional, maybe even resigned. But inside her mind was a flood of late nights and unpaid hours. The fluorescent glow of an empty office, her screen glowing long after everyone else had left. She remembered the time she rewrote the proposal the night before the pitch. Charles had glanced at it once, nodded, and then handed it off to Mark, who presented it the next morning like he'd written every word. He even used her phrasing, her opening line. Her closing strategy. Charles had called it brilliant. Mark had thanked him. Danielle had said nothing, because she knew what speaking up would look like. In meetings, she would raise her hand, clear, confident, ready. But Charles would glance right past her, nod toward someone else. And when that someone repeated her idea minutes later, Charles would nod thoughtfully and say, "Now that's what I'm talking about." It was never subtle, but it was always deniable, and still she stayed. Grace appeared at her side like a quiet storm, arms wrapping around her before Danielle could stop her. She smelled faintly of lavender and printer ink. "This is bullshit," Grace whispered into her shoulder. You worked harder than everyone in this place." Danielle didn't hug back at first. Her arms stayed at her sides, tense. But then she sighed, not from weakness but exhaustion, and let her fingers rest gently on Grace's back. "They never wanted me here," she said simply. Not bitter, not angry, just true. Grace pulled away, blinking fast. Danielle offered a small smile, not of comfort, of understanding. It was never about being good enough. It was about being too much for people who never expected her to belong. And now, she was done trying to fit into spaces that were never built for her. She was 10 years old, standing by the candy rack at Tillman's grocery, gripping a pack of gum she knew she couldn't afford. Across the checkout lane, her mother stood behind the register in her green apron, lips pressed tight as a white woman in a bright scarf pointed and shouted. Danielle didn't hear the full argument, just the edges of it. Something about tone, about respect, about how her mother had an attitude. Her mother had only said, "I asked if she had her receipt. That's protocol." The store manager came out a minute later, didn't ask questions, just pulled her mother aside and told her to clock out. Danielle watched it all, frozen. In the parking lot, her mother's hands trembled as she lit a cigarette. She didn't curse, didn't cry, just sat in the driver's seat, staring through the windshield like she could see the next 20 years of silence stretching ahead of her. Danielle finally whispered, "Why didn't you yell at him?" Her mother turned slowly, then reached out and tucked a loose curl behind Danielle's ear. Her voice was so soft it almost didn't reach over the wind. "Sometimes you walk away in silence so they think you're weak, but silence echoes longer than screams." Now, decades later, Danielle stood across the street from Whitmore Analytics. The glass building shimmered under the Seattle clouds, arrogant and cold like the man who ran it. She didn't cry, didn't rage. She adjusted the strap of her laptop bag over her shoulder, let her gaze rest on the 32nd floor, the one with Charles's corner office. She could have stormed back in, made a scene, demanded justice, but her mother's words were louder, so she turned and walked away. No tears, no noise, just the kind of silence that would echo in boardrooms long after the door closed behind her. Charles Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, a self-satisfied smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth as he scrolled through emails. The sun had dipped behind the downtown Seattle skyline, casting gold across the glass walls of his office, his kingdom, as he liked to call it. Danielle Brooks was gone. Finally. She'd been a thorn in his side for too long. Always asking too many questions. Always outshining people he preferred to keep on top. She was too polished, too good, too unwilling to play the game his way. He sipped his coffee slowly, savoring the taste of unchecked power. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stared at it. Usually he ignored calls like that, but something about it, a ripple in the calm, made him press accept. Charles Whitmore speaking. There was a pause, then a voice, slow, deliberate, unmistakably powerful. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Congressman Elijah Brooks." Charles's hand froze on his coffee mug. "Congressman," he cleared his throat. "Ah, yes, what can I do for you, sir?" Another pause, this one heavier. "I just got off the phone with my niece." Charles's stomach dropped an inch. He didn't speak. "She told me about her termination, and then," Elijah continued, his voice like a steel trap, "she sent me the audio." Charles blinked. "Audio?" "The full recording of your meeting, every word, including your comment about her being a cultural mismatch." Charles stood, pacing toward the window. "Look, Congressman, this was a business decision." "No, Mr. Whitmore, it was a mistake." The words landed like bricks. "You just handed me the final piece I needed for my congressional hearing on systemic bias in tech sector hiring. I've been building this case for months. Your company will be Exhibit A." "Wait a second," Charles said, voice cracking as he scrambled to hold onto the edges of his authority. "Let's not blow this out of proportion. This is all very misinterpreted." Elijah's voice sharpened to glass. She worked there for almost 4 years, with stellar performance reviews, no formal complaints, no warnings, and she gets fired with no cause. Charles was sweating now. He reached for his desk, looking for anything, a script, a lifeline, a way to pivot. "I didn't know she was your niece." "I know you didn't," Elijah said, calm again, the kind of calm that precedes a storm. "Because if you had, you'd have thought twice. But that's the problem, isn't it? You only respect power when you see it in a mirror." Charles opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "You'll be hearing from my office, and from the press. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Whitmore." Click. The line went dead. Charles stood in the middle of his glass fortress, heart pounding like a drum in a courtroom. The air suddenly felt thin, and for the first time in a very long time he didn't feel in control. Danielle didn't sleep that night, not out of grief but clarity. At 3:12 a.m., she opened her laptop. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't tremble, not that anyone could hear it. But the words that had sat lodged in her chest for years finally began to move. She started with the facts. 4 years. 6 promotions delayed. 3 projects presented by others, projects she built. Performance reviews with glowing metrics but stifled language like difficult to manage and strong personality. Then came the screenshots. Emails ignored. Credit stolen. A Slack thread where her idea was dismissed, only to be praised minutes later under a different name. And finally, the last straw, a quiet termination in a glass room under a lie called Culture Fit. She didn't name Charles. She didn't have to. By morning, her LinkedIn post had been shared over 8,000 times. By noon, it was 25,000. The comments flooded in, some supportive, some shocked, and many from former Whitmore Analytics employees. "I know exactly what you're talking about. I was pushed out too, same playbook. You just gave voice to what we all lived through." A former recruiter reposted the thread, writing, "We raised concerns about bias in hiring practices. They told us to stop being dramatic. The dam had cracked. By 3 p.m., Tech Insight Weekly had picked up the story. By 5 p.m., 2 major clients had requested formal meetings. One investor sent a single-line email to the board. What the hell is going on over there?" The board of directors didn't respond publicly. Privately, they moved fast. An emergency meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Crisis consultants were looped in. PR teams were briefed, then rebriefed. Charles was told to stay quiet, but it was already too late. The narrative wasn't in his hands anymore. It belonged to Danielle now, and to everyone who had ever been told they were too much for a culture that was never meant to include them. The world was watching, and for the first time, it wasn't blinking. The office smelled different now. Gone was the sterile, citrusy scent of control, replaced by something sharper, more honest. Paper, cardboard, finality. Danielle stepped through the glass doors of the 32nd floor, heels clicking like punctuation marks in a sentence she had waited years to finish. Charles's office was no longer pristine. Boxes littered the floor. A leather portfolio lay open on his desk, its contents spilling like a body mid-collapse. He was hunched over, trying to force a framed certificate into a box that was clearly too small. His suit jacket was off, sleeves rolled, sweat glistened just above his brow. When he looked up and saw her, he froze, only for a second, then forced a smile onto his face like it still meant something. "Miss Brooks," he said, voice coated in forced civility. "Back so soon?" She didn't answer right away, just scanned the room, the cracked armor, the chaos where power used to sit. "I wanted to see it for myself," she said simply. Charles's jaw twitched. "You know this is temporary, PR mess. They'll ride it out." Danielle didn't respond. "I built this company," he continued, voice rising. My name is on every patent, every deal, every boardroom wall." She tilted her head. "And yet here you are, alone, packing your things in silence." His composure cracked then, ever so slightly. "You think you won?" She stepped forward, her presence still and unmoved. "I didn't have to win," she said, her voice like glass, quiet but impossible to ignore. "You lost all on your own." He opened his mouth, but no words came, just silence. Danielle looked at the framed photo still sitting on his bookshelf, Charles shaking hands with a senator, smiling like he belonged in rooms no one else could touch. She turned toward the door. "You should know," she added without looking back. "They didn't ask me here to replace you. I'm not interested in wearing your title." She paused, just for a breath. "But I am helping decide who does." And then she walked out, leaving behind the man who once thought power meant being feared and who now feared nothing more than being forgotten. The vote was unanimous. Not even Charles's longtime allies on the board raised a hand in his defense. The final resolution was delivered in a brief statement, effective immediately. Charles Whitmore is removed from his role as Chief Executive Officer. The board will begin a formal search for new leadership. No fanfare. No severance parade, just silence. Elijah Brooks didn't celebrate, didn't make calls to the press. He didn't need to. He let the system speak for itself. 2 days later, Danielle sat in a new conference room, not Charles's, but one with wide windows and long light. Her chair had no nameplate, but the weight it carried was unmistakable. She'd been appointed to lead Whitmore Analytics' new Culture and Equity Council, a seat carved not from pity, but recognition. Not everyone on the board agreed with the speed of the appointment. But none dared say it out loud. Her first day back, the walk from the elevator to the meeting room felt different, not because people spoke, they didn't, but because this time they didn't avoid her out of disdain. Now it was guilt. Eyes dropped. Shoulders shrank. The same people who once interrupted her in meetings now suddenly found the floor fascinating. Danielle said nothing. She didn't need to. Her name, once whispered in annoyance, in dismissal, in thinly veiled mockery, now passed through the halls with weight. "Danielle's reviewing that. We should run it by Brooks. She's on the council now, be careful." But Danielle didn't want fear. She wanted truth. And maybe, for the first time in that company's long, curated history, the truth had a seat at the table. Not because they gave it to her, but because she took it with dignity, with proof, with silence that echoed loud enough to change the room. The cafe was nearly empty. A soft hum of jazz floated through the speakers. Cups clinked gently behind the counter. Outside, the Seattle sky had collapsed into rain. Not a storm, just steady, unbothered droplets tracing the windows like memory. Danielle sat by herself, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched in a while. The steam had faded, but the warmth lingered. She didn't have a laptop open, no phone calls, no notes to prepare. For once, there was no battle waiting around the corner. Just space and breath. Her phone buzzed once beside her, a text from a number saved only as Mom. "Saw you on the news, proud of you, baby. Always knew you'd change the room, not just survive it." Danielle let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. She hadn't cried through any of this, but that message, that voice, made something stir deep in her chest. She tapped back, "Love you, still hearing you every step." She set the phone down, leaned back in her chair, and looked out the window. The rain blurred the world into soft shadows. Her reflection hovered in the glass, not the version Charles had tried to define. Not too much, not a fit, just her, whole, still. She thought about the years she spent making herself smaller, smoother, easier to swallow. The long nights spent wondering if silence was survival or surrender, and then in the stillness the truth came clear. "I used to think I had to scream to be heard," she thought, her gaze soft. But silence. Silence is a kind of power, not the weak kind. the kind that makes them listen when you finally do speak. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, no tension, no anger. She didn't feel rage. She felt ready, not to prove anything. Not anymore, but to rebuild, to rise, to make space for the next voice, the next Danielle who deserved more than survival. The rain kept falling, and this time she didn't feel like she was outside the storm. She was the one who brought the weather.